And now for something completely different.
Forget everything you've been told by others before. Get ready for the real deal, the full story, real talk about money, markets, life. Now, it's The Real Investment Show, presented by RIA Advisors.
Good morning. Welcome to The Real Investment Show. I am Danny Ratliff, filling in for Lance Roberts today. With me, I have Sarah Buenger. What a wonderful Monday to come in today. We get to spring forward, and what a great, crazy weekend. So a lot has been going on. Obviously, oil markets are going a bit nuts. I hope you guys filled up last week instead of last night or this morning. But oil prices are certainly shooting up, with fears and expectations that we may hit higher than the 2008 high back when we saw $147 a barrel. WTI hit over 120 this morning. Brent crude has been up to 100. So everybody's eyes are certainly on that. And it puts everybody in a very interesting dynamic. I think one thing that changed over the weekend is President Trump said, we will accept nothing but unconditional surrender out of Iran. So Strait of Hormuz certainly shut down, us ensuring shipments. We have not seen much from that as of yet. But there's a lot going on underneath the surface that markets have probably had a bit of a pullback anyways because of so last week we saw the market down 2%. We're about 3.47% off our January 27th highs, but there is a bit of support beneath us, not a ton. So we do have to be cautious here. But likely we'd have seen a bit of a drop anyways with the labor market. Friday, obviously not very good with 92,000 jobs lost. A big difference in what the expectations were for 55,000 to 60,000 jobs. That certainly changed the game a tad bit. And expectations were likely a bit higher, especially with the revision of January's job numbers. So there is a lot going on. Things that we are watching for this week, CPI, it's going to come out on Wednesday. We have PCE, which is what the Fed looks for, coming out on Friday, and two bond auctions tomorrow and on Thursday. Private credit took it on the chin. So that's reason number two of things that we've been looking for. We saw Blue Owl, Blackstone, BlackRock all have distribution periods either shortened or changed, which is throwing the private credit market for a loop. So as we continue to watch, there are some key technical indicators that we are looking for. I believe it's 65.72 is going to be a big indicator there that we need to see for support going back to, we have January lows and then looking back at, going all the way back to November. Once we get past that initial support, we could look out below. But don't be too concerned. Well, we should be concerned. But at the end of the day, there is a lot that's going on right now. Typically, when we see these spikes in oil, the question will be is how long does this go? Are we going to see this that's going to pop? And if this is now the narrative changing to unconditional surrender, how quickly can the U.S. and Israel get out of Iran is going to be key. And so while we may see this for a bit, we could certainly see a drop here over time. And so when we get into these types of conflicts, generally speaking, we're going to see a decline moving into these. Once we get a little bit more stability or we see a de-escalation, markets will tend to recover. But right now, I believe they're going to follow what energy markets are doing. The Fed is put in a very interesting predicament. We could certainly see, and I think the key word that everybody's looking at right now is stagflation. So we have to be very cautious. This is certainly very inflationary. How much so? That's yet to be seen. And I think the Fed is certainly in a spot where they don't want to get back to what happened in 2022 and be so far behind the curve. You see some Fed chairs coming out over the weekend saying, hey, we could see rates should ideally be about 50 basis points lower. We have many others are saying, hey, we're right where we need to be. The Fed right now doesn't look like they're intending to cut. But with rates where they are and job numbers beginning to deteriorate even more, plus now we have this inflationary push. So with the higher prices of gas, one thing that we're not talking about or hearing a whole lot about is what's going on with, the commodity of fertilization. So food prices could certainly go up. So fertilizers could, from a timing perspective, when this is a time of year when most farmers are actually utilizing it and it's either harder to get to, urea comes out of the Strait of Hormuz. That's a big, big thing right now that we need to consider. So we may see this spike in inflation. Hopefully it's transitory. It's always transitory, but hopefully it's muted and it's not too bad. So buckle up. As Lance would say, if you have not read the Bull Bear Report over the weekend, it may be time to recalibrate, understand, take some profits, just kind of get an idea and a game plan for where you're going. Don't make knee-jerk reactions. Go set that discipline. But we could talk about this for days. We have Sarah, who is, I'm going to make her mad, our tax expert.
You can't say that.
I can say that. I mean, it may or may not be true. She is not a CPA, so she hates being called a tax expert. So if you see the title for the show, we have a ticking time bomb. And so Sarah is here today to talk a little bit about some of the things that we can do, especially as we're getting up on coming up to April 15th. There are considerations that you may still be able to do before then for 2025, but also a great time to kind of think about moving forward. What can you be doing to potentially mitigate taxes in the future? So she's come up with a couple different options here of some different approaches. Really we have a reactive approach, a proactive approach, and then, kind of what the big picture looks like from an estate planning perspective. Sarah, why don't we talk a little bit about what most people do? And that's probably reactive.
True. So in our tax conversation, what we're looking at specifically today is the idea of Roth conversion, and also how to decrease the amount of your tax deferred bucket. We need to look at things from a perspective of how to manage it year over year. So looking at your tax situation, how that changes from one year to another, and take advantage of the opportunities that you have available. And it's not a one and done thing. We have to look at it every year for clients. So the reactive approach is to do nothing. Don't do any kind of Roth conversion. Just kind of let your tax deferred bucket, your IRA rollovers, your traditional IRA, let those grow, continue to compound those earnings. But then when you start to take those out, really your tax situation is being dictated to you, and that could be a problem. We need to take control over that and do what we can to allow that tax bracket to be crafted by us instead of being dictated to us from others. So we have no control over what future administrations will elect into tax law. And for that reason, we need to do what we can now as far as looking at your accounts and making sure that if there are opportunities to pay less in taxes, that you're taking advantage of those.
Yeah, and so when you're talking about, things that, you need to consider. And I think one of the big things that most people do is we wait and see. We have the approach that, and we've been taught for so many years that we're going to go and retire and we're going to be in a much lower tax bracket. So we have this big ticking time bomb in pre-tax dollars. So think about your 401k, your IRA, assets that when you pull from, everything's going to be taxed at ordinary income rates. And what we find over time, especially when you back into the numbers, that many people really aren't in that much of a different tax situation. Because if you think about it, right now, you could, just for easy math, we could say, hey, your gross income is $100,000. But by the time you take out taxes, by the time you take out what you're putting in your 401k, by the time we think about what we save, you're probably not, when you go get into retirement, while you may be pulling down less, it may not be that big of a difference from a tax perspective. So we need to think about that. What does that after-tax dollars look like? What do you have to take out for that? And so by being a little bit more proactive, you have a lot more flexibility down the road. And so we talk often about the back pocket or phantom taxes. So meaning IRMAA, so your Medicare premium surcharge, essentially, for lack of better words, something that many people hit. It is a tax, and it is means testing at its best. So we think about this, it's a cliff. You get, for this year, if you're over $218,000, married filing jointly, you get to $218,001, your premium is going to go up by over $80. So these are things that we need to think about And one thing that I don't think is oft spoken about often enough, the other caveat would be is those RMDs, right? What you have to take out, which can put you into the IRMAA, but also where are we going with taxes? I mean, Sarah, being our tax expert.
Danny, you got to quit that.
I know. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm
no.
joking. She's not a tax expert. She's just very smart.
What we can do from a proactive standpoint is go ahead and look at the taking control over the taxation of that IRA. You can do that during the working years by doing Roth conversions. So if we look at that as one option to be proactive instead of reactive and let your tax situation be dictated to you, we're taking the driver's seat on this one. So we need to look at any low income year as an opportunity to do a conversion. We also need to look at any kind of stock market correction or situation like that where you've got some weakness in the market to potentially do a Roth conversion on sale. So I've had clients ask me, well, what do you mean do a Roth conversion in a down market? Well, if the price of XYZ stock is at 50 and the market has some kind of trouble and the price of XYZ stock goes down to 40 or 30, well, that's an opportunity to do an in-kind Roth conversion of those shares to your Roth. And then in the Roth, if that stock is expected to be one that you hold indefinitely, it may go up in price after that. So essentially it's doing your Roth conversion on sale.
Yeah, and so that's great for a position that maybe you have a high conviction in. You're going to hold for a longer period of time. We see that sometimes where you maybe you did NUA, net unrealized appreciation of a stock, or maybe you're going to hold some still within that IRA. This is an opportunity when you hold it inside the IRA to say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to just completely get out of it, but I want to go ahead and, while it's lower, still have conviction for the future. Go take advantage of that downturn right now. Now, there's a lot of times we may just do it you do it in kind, is what Sarah's alluding to, or you just may say, hey, we have cash, let's move it over. We'd rather see that growth inside of a Roth than in that traditional IRA. Give you an example. We have a client that I work with who is very good about doing Roth conversions. We've had a great market over the last 3 years. And so we kind of laugh. It's like, man, he's been pretty aggressive with doing these conversions, but we're right back in the same spot because now we saw growth again within the IRA. It's like, man, I can't do enough quick enough. And it's a great problem to have. I'd rather have that conversation than like, oh, shoot, it keeps declining. But, that's the problem, is that when we have these funds inside that traditional IRA and they're going to continue to grow and compound within that account, that's not exactly where we want that growth from a tax perspective. Because while we're talking about IRMAA and all these other things, the one thing that is going to hit you at some point is that these RMDs that Sarah talked about a little bit ago, and Brent, pull this up real quick if you could. So this is basically an IRS uniform lifetime income table. This just gives you an idea. So basically, if you look at your age on the left-hand side, you see a life expectancy factor. So you're going to divide your December 31st balance by that divisor, that number. And they're going to tell you or dictate what you must take out of the IRA. So we can see this impacting taxes in many different ways, but we also lose control over it. And so what Sarah's alluding to when she's talking about doing a conversion is that taking control back from Uncle Sam and having a little bit more control of your own destiny. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the estate planning aspect of this, but when we think about RMDs, or, actually, let's take a step back. When you think about a IRA or a 401k, you need to maybe change your mindset. Because when we think about it, if you said, man, I have $1 million in this account, you do, but you don't. And so change this where now this is a business. Okay. Your IRA is a business. But the biggest difference is that you don't control ownership. So if we went out and Sarah and I wanted to create a business, we could say, hey, Sarah, we're 50-50 partners. That's etched in stone. Whereas with Uncle Sam, they can change their ownership at any time. So we don't have that control or flexibility over it. So by going ahead and being proactive, we want to limit, because right now we do have a lower tax code. I know we just made this permanent on July 4th of this last year, but they're spending money like it grows on trees. And unfortunately, you and I are the only people, we're the revenue producers. We are the revenue arm of the government, albeit it's the IRS, but let's be honest, that's because of the income that you guys make. So those are reasons why we need to start thinking about this a little different. So we go back to that chart. The older we get, the more money you actually have to pull out. So you'll notice how that divisor goes down, therefore meaning that the distribution you have to make increases. The IRS's idea behind this, and that's why they use an actuary table, is that they want you to spend your last dollar with one foot in the grave. I mean, really think about it. They don't want you to retain that flexibility. And something else has now changed with Secure Act 2.0 is that we no longer have the ability to do stretch IRAs. I mean, it's funny, Sarah, I don't know if you still talk to people about those, but a lot of people think, number one, they're still there, or they're like, what is that? Well, stretch IRA was, and why don't you maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
Stretch IRA, what happened to IRAs in the past is that a spouse would inherit, and then after the spouse level, whoever inherits after that could take it out over the remaining life expectancy of the decedent or the remaining life expectancy of the person who inherited. That is no longer available. Now they've crunched that timeline down that you have to take the account out to 10 years in most cases. So what happens now is, the spouse will inherit first, and then after that, it could be a line of children. So the kids inherit, they're required to take that account out over 10 years now. And so the taxation piece has been magnified, and the IRS wants their cut of that asset faster rather than letting it perpetuate down the line a bit. So this is another reason for kind of taking the steering wheel and driving your Roth conversions now so that you're in control of the taxes instead of letting that funnel down to your kids. And some people are of the opinion that they want to do the planning for themselves more importantly than the kids, and that's perfectly fine. That's the case-by-case basis that we work with clients on, just to kind of customize things to your desires and your goals. And for that reason, we either need to focus on the estate planning piece. If you want that as a legacy asset, which makes more sense as a Roth IRA than a traditional IRA for them to inherit. So that's one more vote in favor of Roth conversion. One thing I did want to bring up, there's usually at retirement, when people retire before starting Social Security, there's usually a trough that's made in their earning history where your income from employment is no longer coming in, but you haven't yet started your RMDs and your Social Security income. So that trough is a good spot to do your your Roth conversions. It creates space for you to have room in your tax bracket to bring those Roth conversions into the picture. So when we're doing these analysis, we can look at both the income tax bracket as a ceiling. We can also look at an IRMAA tax bracket as a ceiling, as Danny alluded to earlier. If IRMAA is something that could come into the picture for you, we can use that as a top solve rate to see how much room you have before you hit those certain thresholds to bring Roth conversion into the conversation. And we use a combination of planning software as well as tax software to do that. And the most important thing, though, is just to review it every single year, because you could have something in your tax picture that changes from year to year.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing, is that we'll look at long-term projections, but we're going to have to adapt to whatever new legislation comes out, things that may or may not change. But also, much this is so hypothetical in nature. I think that's where a lot of people struggle with this, is that we want something that's just very concrete. Here's how this works. Here's what we're looking for. Unfortunately, we really can't. I mean, we can, and we can make assumptions, but it's hypothetical in nature because we don't know exactly where taxes are going to go. I'm convinced that I think they're going to be higher at some point. I don't know when. I don't know exactly what our runway looks like before we see that change. But as we talk, the pendulum will swing one direction to another. We're in an environment that is much more tax friendly at the moment. It will certainly look different in the future at some point. I just don't know when. And so being able to say, hey, let's hedge our bets a little bit. And maybe you don't convert everything, but you begin to give yourself a little bit more flexibility in the future. I think that's key. We have some people that are very, very aggressive with their conversions. And then we see others that are, hey, their intent is not to take everything out of the Roth, but their intent is to be thoughtful and at least give themselves a little bit more flexibility moving into the future. But you did mention something from that legacy aspect. So there are people that are very concerned with, passing on funds to kids. So creating some generational wealth. That Roth is certainly going to be a much better avenue because of what Sarah discussed with the Secure Act 2.0 on how that's going to impact with that 10-year distribution period for your heirs. Now, keep in mind, that's only for non-spouses. That is not for your spouse. So if I pass away, my wife inherits everything as her own and vice versa. But if it goes to my children, now that's when that 10-year window starts. And so we do need to think about how do you thoughtfully, move money from kind of your left pocket to your right pocket. And that's where that Roth conversion analysis comes into play, thinking about the taxation of it all, and then all of those other little things that kind of come up. And Sarah mentioned, you have that Trough, which is a great way to look at it because that's your opportunity to really decrease those taxes along the way. And really looking at this long term. What are some other things that you encounter or things that you think people should be considering?
Well, the goal, just to kind of go back to what you're talking about before we move on, the goal of doing the conversions is to build 3 buckets. So we want to have access to multiple ways to control our taxes. The first bucket is your tax deferred bucket, which is your traditional IRA, your rollover IRA. Your tax-free bucket is, of course, Roth. And then you've got a taxable bucket, which is all your regular brokerage assets, your bank savings, etc. So having those 3 dedicated buckets gives you the ability to craft a tax bracket each year. So this is something that if you're in a particularly high earning year, you may want to look at doing a QCD. We haven't talked about QCDs yet. You want to loop around to that?
Yeah, I think so. First, let's get to a question. So we had a question on, is Roth conversion expensive? How many percentage to pay for taxes? So how much should you pay? And that's going to differ for everybody. You want to take that one?
It will. It just depends on your tax bracket that you're in. So will the Roth put you into another tax bracket? We can look at that with our tax planning software. Just depends on your income, what you have coming in from outside sources, from employment, from other income like rental income, portfolio income. We have to add all of those details in to get a complete picture of what you're working with, and then we can kind of help you identify exactly how much you're going to be paying in taxes. And of course, this is with tax planning software that we use. If you have a CPA, we would encourage you to run those numbers by them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's always key is that, as I'm giving Sarah a hard time about, her tax prowess, it is, she's not a CPA. So we do, as we're doing these, we do navigate these and look at many different options, but we inevitably want to run that by your CPA. And I do think that's important. So, Sarah, everybody's asking about your background a little bit. So why don't you spend just a moment and your designations, everybody wants to know exactly what that is. So if you can see on the screen, your master's there, but give everybody, not everybody's had the opportunity to meet you.
Okay, I'm Sarah Buenger. I have 26 years of experience in financial planning, so I've been doing this for a minute. On my side work outside of RIA, I also teach for Texas A&M University in their financial planning department. So I really appreciate having the opportunity to do that. It's my way of giving back and building the next group of financial planners that are coming on the scene. One thing that is important to me is lifelong learning, and so I've made an effort to try to stay on that path. For me, the CFP was a starting point. CFP stands for Certified Financial Planner. That's the gold standard of designations if you're coming into the financial planning industry. Next up was a master's degree for me. So that was a master's in personal financial planning. That's the MSPFP. And then you can see the MPAS, MPAS, that's just Master Planner of Advanced Studies. It means that I took extra courses on top of that that were pretty detailed about certain subject matter of my choosing. And then along the way, you continue to get certifications and continuing ed to keep sharp on all the details.
Yeah, I think you'll notice that a lot of a lot of people here have all different types of certifications. Every advisor here is a certified financial planner. But if you go back and dig a little deeper, you'll notice that there's many other designations. So there are times we all may hold the same one, or we may say, hey, you have an area of expertise in this area. I'm going to go get this designation because I'm either, I love that area of the business, or I think this will be good for helping our clients. And so we're always looking at how do we distribute knowledge? Because we all work together, which is a beautiful thing as far as how we operate. And so having people with, certain strengths really works well. I want to get to QCD in a minute though, but we are getting some questions. So, somebody did mention, so Rob mentioned tax brackets are incremental. It doesn't throw your whole income into that tax bracket. But one question, Sarah, was, should we leave future medical expenses in the taxable IRA? So in like a pre-tax. So future medical expenses was the question.
I don't know if I fully understand.
Well, I'll go ahead and answer that then. Okay. So it's okay. So, future medical expenses, it really depends. I mean, I want to try to get as much out of that IRA as possible, just for the simple fact that I believe taxes are going higher. Medical expenses, if you have a health savings account, not everybody does. In fact, I visited with a client who's a doctor on Friday. And one of the conversations we were talking about was diversification of, assets, not necessarily from an asset class perspective, but from an account registration perspective. And I know Rich talked a little bit about that on Friday. But if you have an HSA, one thing that they brought up was that everybody wants to pay them with their HSA. And she's always telling them, like, no, don't do it. Because that health savings account is the only account you get that triple tax benefit. So yes, long term, we want to utilize that in retirement for that. But short term, let those funds grow in the account if you're still working. Another side note in the chat. So if you're not already, go to, I know a lot of you guys listen in different ways. Go to YouTube, go to The Real Investment Show, hit the like and subscribe button, but go in and ask questions on the chat. We do love answering those. What about when somebody's moving? How do you look at that? If they're going to move from maybe a state income tax state to a state with no income tax, would you have somebody delay if they're still living in, we'll pick on a state. Let's say you're in California and you're going to move to Washington State, or you're going to move to Texas, somewhere with no state income tax. Would you typically delay a conversion?
It could be smart to do that. It's definitely something we would look at in our tax software, or before and after. And we can do that scenario planning from year over year and factor in different variables. So if relocating is one of those variables that we need to look at, we can show you the before and after and the bottom line impact to doing that. So yeah, it could be. It depends.
Yeah, and I think it varies. And so a lot of people are going to say, hey, I'm going to stay here. It's not a big deal. Well, then we're going to factor in state income taxes. But if you are considering moving, you do need to share that with your advisor, because it may change, especially if it's going to be something here in the near term where you may say, hey, next year or in 2 years, I plan on moving. Here's where I intend to go. Well, then we can plan for that, and that may change the numbers a bit. And so the more you share, and this comes to anything with financial planning, if we put garbage in, we're going to get garbage out. So the more detail-oriented you can be with your financial plan from a budgeting perspective, from an asset perspective, I can't tell you how many times somebody comes up and they're like, oh, I forgot to tell you, I have this account. It's like, oh, well, that's great, number one, because your plan's probably going to look that much better. But number two, our calculations could be off on a lot of different subject matter that we're trying to discuss. And so the more information you give, and we talk a lot about qualitative stuff, that is extremely important. That qualitative, you may not think that there's anything to it, but if we're thinking long-term, like, hey, I want to be closer to family, we're going to move here. Okay, now we need to think about, what does that mean for your assets? But so talking about being proactive, we have a lot of people that go out and that are great givers. So maybe talk about the qualified charitable distribution. It's another way to potentially reduce income taxes.
That goes in line with one of our proactive points of taking your tax bracket into your own hands. The QCD is an opportunity to get some kind of tax advantage from your giving program. So if you're already someone that gives, you might want to consider looking at QCD. QCD stands for Qualified Charitable Distribution, and that's something that you could do in place of your RMDs. So it takes care of your RMD obligation, and it allows you to shift your charitable into the IRA instead. So why would a person want to do this? Well, if you're giving out a cash flow, you're limited to, I believe, $2,000 for married filing joint for 2026 on an above the line deduction if you take the standard deduction. Now, if you itemize, you can do more, but you're subject to the limits within itemized deductions. So sometimes it's hard to actually get a tax benefit from your charitable piece. Like before it was much easier, now it's a little more difficult. With the QCD, you can actually have the capacity to give as much as $111,000 per year. Now, your RMD amount, using the uniform table, whatever dollar amount that is, let's say you're supposed to take out $25,000 in a year. You could give $25,000 to charity, and it would allow you to alleviate any taxes on that. So your QCD takes the place of RMD. You don't have to pay taxes on it. So what we can do, again, is allow you to shift any kind of giving that you're doing from a bank account, from your cash flow over to the IRA for the purpose of saving taxes on that money where you may not have gotten a tax benefit from it before. So this kind of also leads into the last point about taking a proactive point in doing your tax brackets over multiple years. We've got our 3 buckets to work with: tax deferred, tax free, taxable. If you're in a high income year, it may be a reason to look at QCD if you haven't before, because that's income that you don't have to bring into your ordinary income picture for that year. So you may want to look at that. If you have a particularly low tax year, could be a good year to bring in a Roth conversion into the scene. The unfortunate part about once you start RMDs is that for Roth conversion in those years, you first have to do your RMD. Then you can convert above that. So it makes it harder to try to bring that into a planning picture. Have you seen that, Danny?
Yeah, and so ideally, I mean, if you can start earlier, it is better, but it's not out of the question if you're already taking your RMDs. So that required minimum distribution, so number one, it used to be 70 and a half. That has now changed. It's now 73, but in 2033, it's going to go to 75. So you get a little bit of a longer period of time that you can actually go out and make those conversions before your RMDs are going to be required. But you can do that. It's just now we have to be very mindful of what tax bracket, also the IRMAA. So if somebody noted in the chat, they do a 2-year look back period. So, we have to think about that. If you're even 63, we want to consider IRMAA for when you turn 65, because in 2026, this year, they're looking back at your income for 2024. Now, there can be some cases that can be made that we can go out and fight to get your IRMAA reduced if you've had a life-changing event such as work stoppage, you had a loss of an income-producing property, marriage, death, you name it. But those are things that you need to think about when you're making those types of distributions. Now, you do see, so going back to your question, it just gets harder to do. I think from nobody likes to write a check to Uncle Sam. So when we're having to take a required minimum distribution and then doing a conversion on top of it, and there are a lot of people that do it, it just becomes more difficult. Like, I don't think anybody likes to write that check. So in your experience, do you see more people doing it prior to required RMD age, or do you see, do you have a lot of people that are still doing it afterwards? Your RMDs.
Doing what, Roth conversion? Yeah. No, I don't see very many that want to do the RMD and then Roth conversion. I'm seeing more of them prior to the start of RMDs for sure. Yeah, I think that's going to be something that people spend a lot more time on once, before your RMD age. But so what other ideas and what can people do from a, kind of a planning perspective that they should be considering just from a reduction of taxes long term? Yeah, so in your multi-year strategy, when you're working with your advisor to do this, we just need an income picture. And, once we have that, we can do the scenario planning year after year to see what kind of tax bracket you should be in. You've got your 3 buckets: taxable, Roth, and tax deferred. So again, if you're in a year where there's particularly high income, you could look at the QCDs. You could avoid taking your RMD that way because you're transferring that to QCD instead. So it makes that piece tax negligible. And then you have a Roth bucket that you can pull from if you need additional income from the portfolio. So that allows you to not have any portfolio type income coming into the picture. And then if you're in a lower year, as I said, you could do the RMD to refill your taxable bucket. And then you could do Roth conversion above if you have extra room. The one thing that also comes into the picture, of course, is that review of what tax bracket you're going to be in. And the contributor earlier, you're right, it is a progressive tax system. And so just the conversion amount could put you up into that next bucket, but it's only the incremental amount above the tax bracket that's going to put you there. On IRMAA, though, it's a cliff. So you go over by $1 and you're subject to IRMAA. So we are very cognizant at looking at that when we're doing our analysis for clients. But the point is, having all 3 of those buckets is allowing you to customize your bracket every year.
Yeah, and we can make a compelling argument on many times that, hey, go ahead and get over and pay a little bit into IRMAA, depending on what the intent is in your overall situation. So don't think of IRMAA as like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to pay it. I don't ever want to pay it. I completely understand. However, we need to start thinking about, especially, I have a lot of clients sometimes with concentrated positions that are going to be put over IRMAA if they start to liquidate. But then we begin to think about, okay, what happens if you see a 10% drop within this position, or even a 5%? Is that better taking profits and paying IRMAA than not? And we see that a lot of times, right? Where if you can go ahead and get into an IRMAA bracket because it may be better to actually capitalize and take your profits off the table versus just saying, well, I don't want to pay IRMAA, but then your position declines. And so we see a lot of times that we're so concerned with IRMAA or other taxes in general that we forget the purpose of this. I mean, look, we all want to not pay taxes. Unfortunately, there's no magic wand. We don't have that. We're not pulling a rabbit out of our hat, but there are things that you can do that from a very thoughtful way as we're planning and moving forward to keep more money in your pocket. And that is the intent. I mean, everybody, you guys are probably listening for the wealth management aspect, and Lance talking about the markets, especially today when we've had a crazy weekend. And so you're like, what in the heck? Why are we talking about this? Because guess what? The other part of this whole equation is how to keep more money in your pocket. So always things to be considering. Anything else you want to share before we wrap up today?
No, just one thing to think about on the estate planning piece that we didn't touch on earlier. Just wanted to mention that if you're wanting to leave an asset, of course, it's better to leave a Roth asset than a tax-deferred asset. The tax impact of that, of course, is something to think about. If you've got an account, like you mentioned earlier, worth $500,000 or something, and you're in the 24% bracket, then you're actually leaving let's say your beneficiaries in a 24% bracket, you're actually leaving them, instead of $500,000, an asset worth $380,000. So with the Roth, if you're leaving them that asset instead, they're getting the full impact of the dollars that you're leaving them. So just something to consider.
Yeah, and what tax bracket are they retiring in? What tax bracket are your kids going to be in at that point? So all great things to consider. Sarah, thank you for joining us today. Futures are down at the moment. I do think that we're going to get quite a bit more volatility. Keep your eyes on the Treasury auction. See what that equity risk premium is at the moment, because it is maybe getting a little bit higher. So we'll be keeping our eyes on rates, PCE on Friday, CPI on Wednesday. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll be back with you tomorrow. Everybody have a great day.